The workshop engineer humiliated the unemployed mechanic, who then showed him who was really the master. Tuesday morning dawned with stifling heat in Guadalajara. Roberto Mendez had been working for 15 years at the same auto repair shop in the American neighborhood, a modest place but respected by the neighborhood residents. His calloused, grease-stained hands bore witness to thousands of repaired engines, rebuilt transmissions, and impossible problems solved with patience and dedication. Over the years, Roberto had made that workshop his second home. He knew every tool, every corner, every customer by name. Don Arturo, the owner, had always trusted him, but lately things had changed. Don Arturo's son Mauricio, a recent mechanical engineering graduate from Tecnológico de Monterrey, had returned with modern ideas and a degree he waved like a flag in front of everyone. "Roberto, I need to talk to you," Don Arturo said that morning with an expression Roberto knew all too well. It was the look of someone about to deliver bad news. "Tell me, Don Arturo," Roberto replied, wiping his hands with a greasy rag. "Look, it's not easy to say this, but my son insists that we need to modernize. He wants to bring in new equipment, diagnostic computers, that kind of thing. And for that, we need to reduce staff." Roberto felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "You're firing me, Don Arturo." The old mechanic looked down. "I'm sorry, Roberto. Mauricio says we need younger people with up-to-date technical knowledge. He says mechanics have changed a lot." At that moment, Mauricio entered the workshop with his usual arrogance. He was wearing an impeccable shirt, dress pants, and shoes that had never touched the greasy floor of a workshop. He carried a tablet under his arm and wore a smug smile on his face. "Good morning," he greeted Roberto, looking him up and down. "Dad, I hope you've already talked to him." "Mauricio, show some respect," Don Arturo muttered. "Respect? Dad, look at yourself. This workshop is 20 years behind the times. Today's customers need computerized diagnostics, not someone who guesses problems from the sound of the engine," Mauricio said, laughing with disdain. Roberto clenched his fist but restrained himself. He was not a violent man. He never had been. "I've repaired hundreds of cars in this workshop, Mauricio, cars that no one else could fix." "Yes, of course, with prehistoric methods," replied the young engineer. "Modern mechanics requires precision, data, technology, not improvisation from someone who barely finished high school." The words hit Roberto like hammer blows. It was true that he hadn't been able to continue his studies. His family's poverty had forced him to work since he was 14, but he had learned his trade from old-school teachers, mechanics who knew engines as if they were part of their own bodies. "Mauricio, that's enough," Don Arturo intervened, uncomfortable. "It's the truth, Dad. This business needs professionals with degrees, not amateurs. Roberto can pack up his things. We'll pay him what he's owed." Roberto looked at Don Arturo, searching for some trace of the loyalty they had shared for 15 years. But the old man simply nodded sadly. "I'm sorry, Roberto. It's a business decision." Over the next hour, Roberto packed his personal tools into a cardboard box. Some he had inherited from his father. Others he had bought with the sweat of years of work. The other mechanics watched him in silence, not daring to say goodbye openly. They all knew they could be next. As he left the workshop with the box under his arm and the sun beating down on the back of his neck, Roberto stopped in front of the door. He turned around one last time and saw Mauricio showing Don Arturo something on his tablet, probably some expensive equipment he planned to buy with the money they would save by laying off people like him. He walked through the streets of the American neighborhood, passing colonial houses with colorful facades, taquerias already preparing food for lunch, and street vendors shouting their offers. Guadalajara was bustling with life, but Roberto felt invisible, as if the city had decided that there was no longer a place for men like him. He arrived at his small apartment in the Santa Terry neighborhood. It was a modest place, just 2 rooms that he shared with memories of better times. His wife, Lucia, had died 3 years ago of cancer, and since then Roberto had lived immersed in his work, as if each engine he repaired could fill the void she had left. He set the box on the kitchen table and sat down with his head in his hands. For the first time in many years, Roberto Mendez felt the crushing weight of defeat. He had no significant savings. The apartment bills kept coming, and finding a job at his age would not be easy. Modern workshops were looking for young people with diplomas, not seasoned mechanics with hands stained with experience. As the midday sun streamed through the window, Roberto made a decision. He would not give up. He had faced worse things in life and had come out on top. Mauricio might have his degree in his technology, but Roberto had something that no university could teach. True knowledge, earned through hard work and passion. He got up and looked out the window at the street. Somewhere in this city there were opportunities, he just had to find them. And when he did, he would prove that the true value of a mechanic was not measured in degrees but in results. The first days after being fired were the hardest. Roberto woke up at dawn out of pure habit, but he no longer had anywhere to go. His 15-year routine had evaporated overnight. He had black coffee and sweet bread from the bakery on the corner for breakfast, while he checked the classifieds in the newspaper, marking any ad that mentioned mechanical work with a worn pencil. The interviews were discouraging. At a workshop in the Chapelita neighborhood, a young manager, barely 30 years old, looked at him skeptically when Roberto mentioned his experience. "Do you have any certifications? Are you familiar with OBD2 diagnostic systems? Have you worked with hybrid engines?" asked the manager, drumming his fingers on the desk. "I have 15 years of practical experience," Roberto replied. "I've repaired all kinds of vehicles, from Beetles to American pickups." The manager smiled condescendingly. "Look, Don Roberto, I appreciate your background, but we work with modern technology here. We need people who can connect a computer and read error codes. Mechanics have changed. It was the same story at 5 different workshops. They all wanted youth, certifications, software knowledge, no one valued weathered hands and intuition gained from years of experience." Roberto began to feel that the world had changed without asking his permission, leaving him behind like an obsolete tool. One afternoon, while walking through the historic center of Guadalajara, he passed in front of the cathedral and stopped. Pigeons fluttered in the square. Mariachis rehearsed their songs under the porticos, and tourists took pictures of the Galado Theater. Roberto sat on a bench and watched the city go by. Guadalajara had always been his home, but now he felt like a stranger in his own land. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Javier, his former workshop partner. "Roberto, you have to see this. Mauricio is making a mess here." Roberto frowned and dialed Javier's number. "What happened?" he asked. A 2015 Mustang came in with electrical problems. The customer had already been to 2 workshops and no one could fix it. Mauricio hooked up his computer and said it was a simple oxygen sensor problem. He replaced the sensor, charged 4,000 pesos, and the car is still malfunctioning, Javier explained, lowering his voice. "The customer is furious. He says he's going to sue." Roberto felt a mixture of frustration and satisfaction. The problem isn't the oxygen sensor. Those Mustangs have a manufacturing defect in the electrical harness on the passenger side. They corrode with moisture and cause intermittent failures that look like sensor problems. "That's exactly what I thought. But Mauricio won't listen to me. He says the computer can't be wrong." Javier sighed. "Don Arturo is worried. They're losing customers. Last week, a Jetta that you always fix came back 3 times for the same problem. Mauricio keeps replacing parts according to what his machine says, but he never fixes anything." "I'm sorry, Javier, but it's not my problem anymore," Roberto said, although deep down it hurt him to know that the workshop he had helped build was falling apart. That night, Roberto decided that if the world wouldn't give him a chance, he would create one for himself. He calculated that he had enough savings to survive for 2 months if he was very careful with his expenses. During that time, he would try something he had dreamed of for years, but he had never had the courage to work on his own. He didn't have the money to rent a shop, but he had his tools and his knowledge. He would start by offering home repairs in his own neighborhood. It was humble, yes, but it was a start. The next day, Roberto printed simple flyers at a copy shop. Roberto Mendez, mobile mechanic, 15 years of experience, free diagnosis. He included his cell phone number and a brief list of services. He spent an entire afternoon posting the flyers on poles, small shops, and bulletin boards throughout the sanitary neighborhood and neighboring neighborhoods. The first week, he didn't receive a single call. Roberto began to have doubts. Maybe Mauricio was right. Maybe the world no longer needed mechanics like him. Maybe he should look for another kind of job, perhaps as a security guard or a store clerk. But on the eighth day, his phone rang. "Well, are you the mechanic who puts up the flyers?" asked a female voice with a Guadalajara accent. "Yes, that's me, Roberto Mendez, at your service. Look, I have a 2010 Suru that won't start. I've already called several mechanics, but they all want to take it to the shop and charge me for the tow truck. Can you come take a look at it?" "Of course, ma'am. Give me your address." Half an hour later, Roberto arrived at a modest house in the Felipe Angeles neighborhood. A woman in her 50s greeted him at the entrance, where a white Nissan Suru sat motionless. "It won't even start," said the worried woman. "And I need it for work. I'm a nurse at the public hospital." Roberto opened the hood and began his ritual. He checked the battery connections, tested the alternator, listened to the sound of the starter motor. In less than 10 minutes, he identified the problem. The ignition switch solenoid was worn out. "It's a small part, ma'am. I can get it at a nearby auto parts store. It's about 350 pesos for the part, plus 200 for my labor. Is that okay with you?" The woman nodded with relief. 2 hours later, the churro started perfectly. The woman was so grateful that she gave him an extra 550 pesos tip. "You really know your stuff, Roberto." The other mechanics wanted to replace the entire starter motor. That would have cost me more than 2,000 pesos. Roberto left with his chest puffed out with pride. It was just a small job, but it was his. He had earned that money with his own knowledge and effort. No one could take that away from him. That night, he slept better than he had in weeks. The job with the nurse's churro was the first of many. The grateful woman recommended Roberto to her colleagues at the hospital. Within 2 weeks, Roberto had 4 more customers. A teacher with a Chevy that vibrated when accelerating, a taxi driver with an Aveo that consumed too much oil, a college student with an ATOS that had brake problems. Each one came on recommendation. Each one left satisfied. Roberto worked from early morning until late at night, moving around the city on buses with his toolbox slung over his shoulder. Guadalajara was huge, and sometimes it took him longer to get from place to place than to do the repairs themselves. But he didn't mind. Each satisfied customer was a personal victory against those who had dismissed him as obsolete. One October afternoon, while repairing the alternator of an F-150 pickup truck in the Providencia neighborhood, the owner of the vehicle, a businessman named Gerardo Salazar, watched with curiosity. "Did you learn this in school?" Gerardo asked, impressed by Roberto's speed and precision. "No, sir. I learned it by working, watching, asking questions. My dad was a mechanic and taught me the basics. I learned the rest over the years." "It's rare to find people like that nowadays," commented Gerardo. "My son studied business administration at ITESO and can't even change a tire. He wants to solve everything with cell phone apps." Roberto smiled as he adjusted the alternator belt. "Technology is important, Don Gerardo. I don't deny it. But there are things you can only learn with your hands. Cars are machines, but they also have personality. Each one sounds different, vibrates differently. No computer can tell you that." Gerardo was so impressed that he gave him his business card. "I have 3 more cars at home and several partners who are always looking for reliable mechanics. I'm going to recommend you." And he kept his word. The following week, Roberto received 5 more calls, all from Gerardo's contacts, business people, professionals, people with high-end vehicles who had lost confidence in traditional repair shops. They were all looking for someone honest, who wouldn't try to sell them unnecessary repairs, who really understood what they were doing. Roberto began to earn more money than he did at Don Arturo's shop. He wasn't rich, but he could pay his bills and save a little. More importantly, he regained something he had lost: his dignity. One morning in November, while having coffee at a street stall in the American neighborhood, he saw Mauricio drive by in a new BM, but the young engineer was behind the wheel, talking on the phone with his usual look of superiority. Roberto felt a twinge in his chest, but it was no longer envy or resentment. It was simple indifference. His phone rang. It was Javier again. "Roberto, you still don't want to come back. Don Arturo asked me to call you. He says if you want to come back, talk to him." "What happened?" Roberto asked, although he already imagined the answer. "Mauricio is ruining the business. Customers are leaving. Last week, Mr. Gonzalez, remember him? He brought his Silverado in for transmission service. Mauricio told him he needed to replace the entire transmission, 30,000 pesos. Mr. Gonzalez went to another shop and only needed to change the filter and fluid. 3,000 pesos. Roberto sipped his coffee slowly. Javier, I appreciate Don Arturo thinking of me, but I don't want to come back. I'm working on my own and doing well. Seriously? You have your own shop now? Not exactly. I work from home. It's more honest and customers appreciate it. I don't have to charge them for the tow truck or make them wait for days. I go to where they are, fix their problem, and that's it. Javier was silent for a few seconds. That sounds good, Roberto. I'm happy for you. Hey, do you need help? I'm thinking about leaving too. Mauricio made Raul quit last week because he disagreed with his diagnosis of an accord. It's not the same anymore. Roberto smiled. I'm fine for now, Javier, but I appreciate it. If things keep growing, I'll call you. That afternoon, while Roberto was under a car in the Lomas de Zapopan neighborhood repairing an oil leak, his phone rang again. It was an unknown number. Hello, this is Carolina Reyes speaking. I have a trusted repair shop in the Jardines del Bosque neighborhood, but we have a difficult case that no one has been able to solve. Gerardo Salazar recommended that I call you. Could you come take a look at a car? Of course, Miss Carolina. Tell me, what is it about? It's a 2018 Mercedes-Benz C300. The customer is a German businessman and has spent more than 40,000 pesos on diagnostics and repairs at official dealerships. The car continues to malfunction, randomly losing power, sometimes not starting, but the computers can't find any definitive error. Roberto felt a tingle of excitement. This was the kind of challenge he loved. I'm on my way. Give me the address. An hour later, Roberto was standing in front of an immaculate workshop with polished concrete floors and modern equipment. Carolina Reyes turned out to be a young woman of about 35, wearing mechanic's overalls and with grease-stained hands. Roberto was pleasantly surprised. It was not common to see female mechanics in Mexico. Don Roberto? Welcome, Carolina greeted him. I'll tell you the situation. Hans, the owner of the Mercedes, is desperate. The Mercedes dealership has replaced sensors, control modules, injectors, everything. They've rebuilt half the car, and the problem persists. Roberto approached the silver Mercedes. It was a beautiful car with only 40,000 kilometers on the odometer. He opened the hood and began his inspection. He didn't connect any computers or scanners. He simply looked, touched, and listened. After 20 minutes, he asked for the keys and started the engine. He listened carefully, then turned it off and started it again. He repeated the process several times. When did the problem start? Roberto asked. About 8 months ago, Carolina replied, consulting a file. The owner travels a lot and spends half the year in Germany and the other half here. Aikishi, and during his absences, the car stays parked. Exactly. Sometimes for 2 or 3 months in a row. Roberto nodded. I know what the problem is. It's not electronic, it's the gasoline. Carolina looked at him confused. The gasoline? But the computers don't show any mixture error because it's not a mixture error, it's decomposed gasoline. When a car is left stationary for so long, especially in the humid climate of Guadalajara, the gasoline becomes contaminated with moisture and loses octane. That causes difficult starts and intermittent power loss. Modern computers aren't programmed to detect degraded fuel because they assume people use their cars regularly. Carolina's eyes widened in surprise. We never thought of that. How do you fix it? Simple. You have to drain the entire fuel system, clean the tank, change the filter, and fill it with fresh gasoline. I would also recommend installing a fuel stabilizer if the car is going to be parked for long periods of time. Carolina immediately called Hans and explained the situation in English. The German arrived at the workshop in less than half an hour. Intrigued, he was a tall 50-year-old man with a strong accent but fluent in Spanish. Do you think it's the gasoline? Hans asked skeptically. The Mercedes engineers didn't mention that. With all due respect, said Roberto, Mercedes engineers have probably never seen a car that sits parked for 3 months in the Guadalajara climate. This is something I learned from experience, not from manuals. Hans stared at him and then smiled. I like your honesty. Do it. If it works, I'll recommend you to everyone I know. The work on the Mercedes took a whole day. Roberto meticulously drained the fuel system, cleaned the tank by hand, replaced the filter, and filled the tank with fresh premium gasoline. He also cleaned the injectors and checked the fuel lines for corrosion. Carolina watched every move with professional interest. "I've never seen anyone work like that," she commented as Roberto finished assembling the fuel pump. "So methodical, so confident. Most mechanics would have started by randomly changing parts. The problem with modern mechanics," Roberto explained as he cleaned his tools, "is that many people have stopped thinking. They blindly trust computers, but computers only know what they are programmed to know. They can't use common sense." When they were done, Carolina turned the key in the Mercedes. The engine started immediately, smooth as silk. They left it running for 30 minutes without any problems, turned it off, and turned it back on. Perfect. Carolina drove the car around the neighborhood, accelerating, braking, testing it in different conditions. The Mercedes responded flawlessly. Hans arrived at sunset. When he saw his car running smoothly, his face lit up. He drove it himself for 15 minutes and came back completely convinced. "Incredible," he exclaimed. "How much do I owe you?" Roberto quickly calculated his labor, parts, and materials. Altogether, it would be 4,500 pesos. Mr. Hans, the German, took out his wallet and handed him a wad of bills. "Here's 10,000 pesos. The rest is a tip. You saved me from throwing more money away at the Mercedes dealership, and more importantly, you gave me my car back." Roberto tried to refuse the tip, but Hans insisted. Before leaving, the businessman left him his business card. "I have many contacts in the Guadalajara business community. Get ready to receive calls," and he certainly did. In the following days, Roberto's phone didn't stop ringing. A bank manager with an Audi A4, a doctor with a Volvo X60, a lawyer with a Lexus. They all came on the recommendation of Hans or Gerardo. They had all had bad experiences with large agencies and repair shops. They were all looking for someone honest and competent. Roberto had to start turning down jobs because he physically couldn't handle them all. That's when he made an important decision. He called Javier. "Are you still interested in working with me?" Roberto asked. "Are you serious?" Javier replied excitedly. "Absolutely. I need help. There's more work than I can handle on my own. I'll pay you by the day and we'll split the tips. What do you say? I'll quit the workshop tomorrow." With Javier by his side, Roberto was able to take on more jobs. The two made a good team. Roberto with his experience and accurate diagnosis, Javier with his youthful energy and speed in repairs. They rented a small space in the Santa Terry neighborhood, barely 30 meters, but it was enough to store tools and handle emergencies. Most of the jobs were still at people's homes. One Saturday in December, while Roberto and Javier were repairing a Malibu in the parking lot of a residential building in the American neighborhood, they heard an engine revving nearby. Roberto looked up and felt his stomach sink. It was Mauricio's BMW. Don Arturo's son parked his car and got out with an annoyed expression. He was wearing expensive sportswear and sunglasses, but his face showed signs of stress. "Look at that," Mauricio said sarcastically. "The unemployed mechanic is now playing at running his own little business." Roberto slowly stood up and wiped his hands. "Mauricio, what brings you here?" "Curiosity. I've heard rumors that you're out there fixing cars." "I guess necessity is the mother of invention." Javier took a step forward, but Roberto stopped him with a gesture. "It's not necessity, Mauricio, it's passion. Something you would never understand." "Passion." Mauricio laughed. "Please, I studied for 5 years at the best university in the country. You barely finished high school. There's no comparison." "You're right," Roberto said calmly. "There's no comparison. I know how to fix cars. You know how to read computer screens." Mauricio's face turned red. "You know what? I'm tired of you talking badly about me all over town. People tell me that you're supposedly a better mechanic than me. It's ridiculous." "I never speak badly of anyone," Roberto replied. "My work speaks for itself." "Well then, let's prove it," Mauricio snapped. "Right here, there's a car with problems parked over there." He pointed to a Volkswagen Bora with a for sale sign on the windshield. "Find out what's wrong with it. If you fix it, I'll publicly acknowledge that you're better than me. If you can't, you stop working in Guadalajara." Roberto looked at the Bora, then looked at Mauricio. The young engineer was so full of arrogance that it almost radiated. Roberto knew that falling for provocations was foolish, but something in him wanted to prove a point. Not out of personal pride, but for all the honest mechanics who had been belittled by people like Mauricio. Okay, Roberto said, but on one condition. If I fix it, you go to Don Arturo and tell him you made a mistake in firing me, and you publicly apologize to all the mechanics you've humiliated. Mauricio extended his hand. Deal. They shook hands while Javier and the owner of the Malibu watched curiously. Roberto approached the Bora and spoke to the owner, an elderly man who was selling it because he could no longer repair it. It won't start, young man, the man explained. I took it to 3 different repair shops. They all tell me different things. I've already spent more than 8,000 pesos and it's still the same. Roberto asked for the keys and opened the hood. Mauricio approached with his tablet and an OBD scanner, smiling confidently. He connected the scanner and began checking error codes. Roberto, on the other hand, didn't touch any electronic tools. He simply observed, looking at the engine, the connections, the cables. Then he turned the key. The engine turned but didn't start. He listened carefully to that sound, that rhythm he knew so well. After 5 minutes, Roberto smiled. He knew exactly what it was. Mauricio was still engrossed in his tablet, downloading software updates and running diagnostics. Meanwhile, Roberto walked to his truck and returned with a simple tool, an electrician's screwdriver. He crawled under the Bora's dashboard and came out after 2 minutes. Done, he said simply. Done? What? Mauricio asked without looking up from his tablet. You haven't even done anything. Roberto turned the key. The engine started immediately, purring perfectly. The older man opened his eyes in surprise. Mauricio stood frozen with his mouth open. Javier began to laugh. What did you do? Mauricio stammered. Roberto pointed under the dashboard. The fuel pump relay was loose. The vibrations from the road were causing it to disconnect intermittently. The previous 3 repair shops had probably replaced the pump, the injectors, even the ignition module, but no one had checked something as simple as a loose relay. Mauricio looked at his tablet, then at the chrono, then at Roberto. His expression was a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Your computer was never going to tell you that, Roberto continued, because it's not a system error. It's a basic mechanical problem that you can only find with experience and common sense. The owner of the Malibu applauded. The man with the Bora shook Roberto's hand with tears in his eyes. How much do I owe you? Nothing, sir. It was just a matter of tightening a connector. Mauricio slowly put away his tablet. For a moment, it looked like he was going to say something, but he simply turned and walked toward his BM. A deal. It's a deal, Mauricio reminded Roberto. I hope you keep your word. Mauricio paused with his hand on the door handle. Without turning around, he muttered something inaudible and got into the car. He started the engine and drove away with a screech of tires. Javier approached Roberto. He's not going to keep his word, is he? Roberto shrugged. Probably not, but it didn't matter. Today wasn't about humiliating him. It was about proving that real knowledge is worth more than any college degree, and I think everyone here saw that clearly. News of the challenge between Roberto and Mauricio spread through Guadalajara like wildfire. In workshops, auto parts stores, in Facebook groups for mechanics, everyone was talking about how an old-school mechanic had solved in 5 minutes what an engineer with his technology couldn't do in an hour. The story had been embellished a little with each retelling, but the essence remained. Experience had defeated arrogance. To Roberto's surprise, Mauricio did keep part of his promise, although not exactly as he had expected. A week after the incident, Don Arturo called him. Roberto, I need to see you. Could you come to the workshop? Roberto hesitated. After everything that had happened, returning to that place brought back bittersweet memories, but he respected Don Arturo too much to refuse. When he arrived at the workshop that December afternoon, he found Don Arturo alone in the office. The old mechanic looked tired, older than Roberto remembered. Thank you for coming, Don Arturo said, pointing to a chair. I want to talk to you man to man. Roberto sat down silently. Mauricio told me what happened with the Bora, Don Arturo continued. In his own way, of course, trying to justify himself. But I know my son, and I know when he's making excuses. I've also been listening to what people are saying on the street. Don Arturo paused and looked out the window at the empty workshop. The lifts were empty of cars, the tools tidy but unused. This place is dying, Roberto. In 3 months, we lost 60% of our customers. The only ones who come are those who haven't heard the stories. Mauricio replaced expensive parts unnecessarily. He charged for diagnostics that led nowhere, and his attitude drove away people who had been coming here for 20 years. I'm sorry, Don Arturo, Roberto said sincerely. The old man looked at him with tired eyes. I'm sorry too, Roberto. I made a mistake. I let my son convince me that modernization was more important than experience, that degrees were more valuable than calloused hands. I was wrong, Don Arturo. Let me finish. The old man interrupted. I know you're doing well on your own now. I've been told you have more work than you can handle. I'm not here to ask you to come back as an employee. I'm here to propose something different. Roberto raised an eyebrow, intrigued. I want you to be a partner in the workshop, said Don Arturo. 50-50. You bring your experience and your reputation. I'll provide the premises and the equipment. We'll work together as we should have done from the beginning. Roberto was speechless. It was a generous offer, tempting even, but something in him had changed during those months of working on his own. Don Arturo, I really appreciate the offer, I do, but I've discovered that I like working independently. I like going to where the customers are, getting to know their stories, working in their homes. It's more personal, more human, and I don't have to answer to anyone but my own conscience. Don Arturo nodded slowly. I understand you're a free man now. That's something valuable. But, Roberto continued, there is something that could work. We could be allies. When you have jobs that require my expertise, you call me. When I need to use specialized equipment that I don't have, I come here. We support each other, but each of us maintains our independence. A slow smile spread across Don Arturo's face. I like that idea. Like in the old days, when mechanics helped each other, they shook hands, this time as equals. And Mauricio? Roberto asked. Don Arturo sighed. I told him he needs to learn humility. I sent him to work for 6 months in a workshop in Tonalá with a master mechanic who can't stand arrogance. If he wants to come back here after that, he'll be welcome. But he'll only learn to value knowledge, wherever it comes from. Roberto left the workshop feeling that a cycle had come to an end. There were no hard feelings, no winners or losers, just two men who had learned important lessons about respect, experience, and humility. The following months were ones of steady growth. Roberto and Javier hired 2 young mechanics who wanted to learn the trade the traditional way. Roberto became a mentor, teaching them not only how to repair cars, but also how to diagnose problems using all their senses, treat customers with honesty, and value every job, no matter how small. The small shop in the sanitary neighborhood became a landmark. It had no flashy signs or cutting-edge technology, but it had something better: reputation. People traveled from all over the Guadalajara metropolitan area to have Roberto check their cars, and he never lost the habit of also making house calls for customers who couldn't get around. One February afternoon, while Roberto was teaching one of the apprentices how to identify suspension problems, a BMW pulled up in front of the shop. Roberto recognized the car immediately, but the person who got out surprised him. It was Mauricio, but a different Mauricio. He was dressed in simple work clothes. His hands were stained with grease, and he had a more humble expression on his face. Hello, Roberto. He greeted him in a softer voice than before. Mauricio responded cautiously. What brings you here? I've come to. Mauricio cleared his throat. I came to apologize for everything, for treating you with contempt, for believing that my degree made me superior, for not valuing your experience. Roberto put down his tool and approached him. What happened in Tonalá? Mauricio smiled ironically. They made me do the most basic jobs, oil changes, tire rotations, jobs that I considered beneath me. Don Ramiro, the owner of the workshop, told me he wouldn't teach me anything advanced until I learned humility. And you were right about everything, Roberto. Technology is a tool, but without experience, without really understanding how machines work, it's useless. I'm glad you learned that, Roberto said sincerely. There's something else, Mauricio continued. I've been thinking. You have the knowledge and the clientele. I have access to technology and training and new systems. How about we combine the two, not as boss and employee, but as colleagues? We could offer something unique, traditional diagnostics backed by modern technology. Roberto thought about it. It was an interesting proposal. For months, he had noticed that some new cars did indeed require diagnostic equipment that he didn't have. And Mauricio, with his pride in check, could be a valuable asset if he had truly learned his lesson. First, you have to prove something to me, Roberto said. I have a 2020 Corolla with a strange problem. The computers can't find any errors, but the customer complains of vibrations when braking. Can you diagnose it without using your scanner? Mauricio nodded. Over the next hour, he methodically checked the waveform, spun the wheels, checked the brake discs, and tested the calipers. Finally, he found the problem. One of the brake discs had been replaced with a low-quality part that didn't exactly match the thickness of the original, causing uneven braking that the computers didn't detect because technically everything was working. Roberto smiled. Approved, but you'll start as an apprentice for 3 months, with no fixed salary, just commissions for jobs well done. After that, we'll talk about partnership. That seems fair to me, Mauricio replied, extending his hand. The story of Roberto Mendez became legendary in Guadalajara's mechanic circles, not because he had beaten someone in a challenge or because he had built an empire. He became a legend because he demonstrated something fundamental, that true knowledge does not come only from books or screens, but from years of experience, from hands stained with grease, from ears trained to listen to what machines say. His workshop in the sanitary neighborhood never became a franchise or $1 million business, but it became something more valuable, a place where young mechanics learned that the trade was as much an art as it was a science, where customers knew they would be treated honestly, where technology and experience worked together rather than competing. Years later, when engineering students from Tecnológico de Monterrey visited workshops as part of their practical training, many professors took them specifically to Roberto's workshop. He didn't have the most modern facilities or the most expensive equipment, but he had something that no university laboratory could replicate: hard-earned wisdom, humility learned through hardship, and a passion for a trade that was in his blood. Roberto never sought revenge against Mauricio. He didn't have to. He simply continued doing what he did best, fixing cars with honesty and dedication. And in the end, that was enough to show who the real master was. Evening falls on Guadalajara. The sun paints the colonial facades orange as Roberto closes the workshop. Javier has already gone home to his family. The apprentices are putting away the tools. Mauricio, now genuinely integrated into the team, reviews the diagnosis of a Tesla that will arrive early tomorrow. Roberto stands at the entrance for a moment, watching the street. He went from being a disposable employee to being his own boss, from being humiliated to being respected, from losing everything to building something truly valuable. It wasn't an easy road, but it was his road. And as he locks the door and walks to the bus stop, his hands stained with grease and his body tired but satisfied, Roberto Mendez knows one thing with absolute certainty. No college degree, no technology, no arrogance can replace the value of a man who knows his craft, respects his work, and treats people with dignity. In today's Mexico, where so many seek shortcuts and external validation, Roberto represents something increasingly rare: authenticity. And at the end of the day, that's what really matters. M.